Some nurses confuse confidence with competence, and that's when patients die. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 47 minutes before the Pentagon arrived. He stood in the conference room at St. Michael's in San Diego with 17 residents arranged in careful rows, their notebooks open, their pens poised, their eyes reflecting the fluorescent brightness of a man who had never been questioned in his life. The room smelled of coffee and floor wax and the particular staleness of air that circulated through hospital walls at 2 in the morning. Caldwell's white coat was pressed so perfectly it could have cut glass, and when he spoke about protocol and ego and the dangerous impulse of nurses to think they understood medicine, his voice carried the weight of a man accustomed to being right. His hands moved with practiced authority as he gestured toward his audience, and somewhere in that moment between one breath and the next, he believed every word he was saying. Competence was a privilege reserved for those with degrees on their walls. Competence was not something that came from keeping your head down and your eyes open and your hands steady through 3 years of night shifts in an emergency room that had stopped asking your name. Hannah Clarke moved through the hallways of St. Michael's like a person who had learned the art of being invisible. 3 years. 36 months of showing up to third shift, clocking in at 10:45 p.m., and moving through the corridors with a kind of silence that made her colleagues forget she was there. Her scrubs were navy blue, unremarkable. Her badge was worn from repeated badge swipes. Her hands had calluses that didn't quite match the soft-palmed residents who rotated through like medical tourism, and when a difficult fur line needed to be placed on a diabetic patient with collapsed veins or a septic child whose blood vessels had already given up their secrets, the charge nurse always knew exactly who to call. Not because Hannah was famous. Because Hannah was there. Because Hannah's hands never trembled. Because when she threaded a 20-gauge needle through tissue that felt like it might tear and the vein was hiding somewhere near the surface and the patient was crying, Hannah breathed and the needle found what it was looking for the first time. Always the first time. The patients noticed. They noticed the scars on her forearms too, if they looked carefully during those moments when she rolled up her sleeves to scrub in. Geometric patterns. Almost surgical. Almost like they told a story about where her hands had been before they became the hands that kept them alive. She kept her past buried where the military had ordered it to stay. The discharge paperwork was clear on that point. Classified details were to remain classified. Her name was to be associated with no combat operations, no deployments, no tour locations that might trigger a security review. The Pentagon had been very specific. Hannah Clarke was to exist as a civilian nurse in a civilian hospital in a civilian life that had absolutely nothing to do with Tikrit or the 75th Ranger Regiment or the fact that she had pulled 12 soldiers out of a burning compound while rounds punched through the walls like angry wasps and a piece of shrapnel had creased her shoulder blade and she had kept moving because moving was all that kept you alive. 3 years at St. Michael's meant nobody knew. Nobody asked. Nobody looked at her and saw anything other than a quiet nurse with good hands and a tendency to complete her charts with unusual precision. Dr. Caldwell recognized a threat when he saw one. He sat in his office on the 3rd floor, the one with the oak desk and the window overlooking the parking lot where rain was beginning to fall in the kind of heavy sheets that turned the asphalt into a mirror. His name was embossed on the door. Director of Emergency Medicine. The title meant he controlled hiring, firing, billing codes, and the distribution of resources that had somehow begun to increase in cost at a rate that financial audits had stopped asking about. He had built an empire on 3 principles: inflate the billing codes, document procedures that never happened, and surround yourself with residents who were too busy staying awake to ask questions. It was a beautiful system. It had worked for 9 years. It would have worked forever if Hannah Clarke hadn't started asking about treatment codes in a way that suggested she was actually reading the medical literature instead of accepting the hospital's standard operating procedures as gospel. She had questioned why pediatric lacerations were being coded as level for complexity when the wound repair required basic suturing and no surgical intervention. She had asked about supply orders that showed 47 units of specialty wound dressings dispensed in a single shift when the ER census showed only 19 patients and the incident reports detailed no major trauma. She had looked at him during rounds one morning and said, very quietly, "Dr. Caldwell, that patient's chart notes don't match the billing code," and the way she said it was not confrontational. It was not aggressive. It was simply accurate. And accuracy was Caldwell's only real enemy. He watched her from the window of his office now, moving through the ER with the kind of purposeful efficiency that made other nurses look like they were wading through water. She was at the vending machine near the trauma bay, inserting coins with deliberate precision, and two of the residents who had been in Caldwell's lecture were laughing at something, their voices carrying that particular edge of cruelty that belonged to people who had never been genuinely tested. One of them pointed toward Hannah as she waited for her coffee to drop. "Nurse nobody," the first one said, and his friend laughed hard enough that his shoulders shook. She actually thought she could second-guess the boss about that coding. Like she's been to med school. The second resident shook his head, and Hannah reached down to collect her coffee from the dispenser, her movements neither hasty nor particularly slow. She simply moved the way someone moves when they are completing a task, and then she was gone, walking back toward the acute care section with the paper cup in one hand and her composure intact. Caldwell smiled from his window. He watched the residents laughing at a woman they would never understand, and he felt the particular satisfaction of a man who had just discovered the perfect lever. Hannah Clarke had made herself visible by asking the wrong questions. Now she needed to be reminded of her place. Not through direct confrontation, which could be documented and disputed, but through the kind of social pressure that made hospitals function, the unspoken hierarchy that placed physicians above nurses and certain nurses, the ambitious ones, the questioning ones, even lower than the rest. It wouldn't take much. Just the right moment. Just the right audience. Just enough leverage to remind her that she was expendable. The night shift had truly begun now. Rain hammered the windows in the waiting room like applause or accusations, and the distant wail of an ambulance siren grew louder, then louder still, until it was clear that someone's tragedy was about to become St. Michael's problem. The ER doors were already opening. The triage nurse was already moving. The waiting room was filling with the particular energy that preceded a multi-vehicle collision or a mass casualty incident, that moment when hospital systems shifted into something faster and more desperate than normal operating procedure. Hannah was at the supply station, pulling dressings and 14-gauge angiocath needles and four stands with the kind of quiet automaticity that suggested her hands already knew what they would need before her mind had consciously processed the incoming sirens. The combat medic who had arrived on a rotation from Camp Pendleton 2 weeks ago was nearby, preparing medications, and there was something in the way that Hannah moved through the supply room that made him pause for just a moment. The economy of motion. The absence of wasted energy. The kind of precision that didn't come from protocol training. He had served 14 months with the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment before taking a medical rotation stateside. He knew how soldiers moved. He knew how combat medics moved. He knew the particular stance of someone who had learned medical skills not in a classroom but in the field, where mistakes didn't result in a patient complaint form but in a flag-draped casket. There was something in the way this quiet nurse positioned herself, the angle of her shoulders, the way her eyes catalogued the room while her hands continued working without requiring her visual attention. He nearly said something. He almost asked a question that would have changed everything 47 minutes before the Pentagon arrived with a folder that contained her name and her rank and the truth about every moment she had spent pretending to be ordinary. But the sirens were louder now. The ER doors were opening. The night was about to demand everything from every person in this hospital who was capable of giving it. And Hannah Clarke simply continued her work, moving through the controlled chaos of preparation with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The worn combat boots were waiting for her in the garage at home, wrapped in newspaper, hidden in a place where nobody would ever think to look. But her hands were here. Her competence was here. Her 3 years of invisibility were about to end whether she wanted them to or not. The first ambulance was pulling into the bay. Thursday morning arrived like any other morning at St. Michael's in San Diego. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar electric prayer across the ER corridors. Hannah Clarke stood in the back corner of the Grand Rounds amphitheater, her patient clipboard held against her chest like armor, watching Dr. Caldwell command the room with the ease of someone who'd never questioned his right to be there. 23 residents and attending physicians filled the tiered seating, their attention locked on him like he was scripture being read from the mount. He moved through the space with the fluid precision of a man accustomed to worship, his voice dropping to conspiratorial intimacy when he wanted to make a point land harder. "This case here," Caldwell said, holding up a chart, her chart, "represents exactly what I've been warning about in these halls. Cowboy medicine. The kind of dangerous overreach that happens when someone confuses confidence with competence." He let the words hang in the air like smoke. His reading glasses caught the light as he scanned the pages, his expression arranged into perfect concern. "Nurse Clarke here questioned my antibiotic selection on a sepsis case. A patient with a temperature of 104.3 degrees, lactate of 8.2, already hypotensive by 15%. And yet, she felt empowered, emboldened, really, to write in this chart, recommend broader spectrum pending culture results." He pronounced the words with exaggerated slowness, as if they were a child's first attempt at reading. "In writing, ladies and gentlemen. Not a suggestion. Not a question. A recommendation. To a physician with 15 years of emergency medicine experience." Hannah's jaw tightened until the muscles along her temples began to ache. Her hands remained exactly where they were, steady, fingers curled loosely around the clipboard's metal clip. Her eyes found a point on the far wall, just above the residents' heads, and stayed there. Not looking away. Not looking down. Just looking through. The technique had kept her alive through 3 tours in Tikrit. It would keep her alive through this. "The thing about nursing school," Caldwell continued, circling closer to where she stood, his voice taking on a teaching quality that made it somehow worse than simple cruelty, "is that it teaches protocol. It teaches safety checklists. Which is valuable. Absolutely valuable. But it doesn't teach differential diagnosis. It doesn't teach the clinical judgment that comes from a decade of being wrong, then learning, then being wrong again. That's a physician's education. That's my education." He turned to face the residents directly, and his smile was a weapon freshly sharpened. "So when someone with a 3-year credential starts second-guessing someone with 15 years of board certification, we need to call that what it is: boundary violation. Professional overreach. And dangerous, frankly." The laugh that rippled through the amphitheater was nervous, uncertain, the kind of laugh that happens when junior physicians sense the direction of power and align themselves accordingly. Hannah's breathing remained even. In through the nose for 4 counts. Hold for 4. Out for 4. The same rhythm she'd used in a Tikrit compound when the temperature hit 127 degrees and the walls hadn't stopped shaking from the explosions outside. "Tell me, Nurse Nobody," Caldwell said, and the nickname landed exactly as intended. Several residents shifted in their seats, uncomfortable but complicit. "Did they happen to teach you at your nursing program that antibiotic selection requires understanding the institutional resistance patterns, the patient's renal function, the difference between empiric and targeted coverage?" He paused, inviting response. The silence stretched like taffy. He nodded slowly, as if her refusal to speak confirmed everything he'd already believed. "That's what I thought. Protocol. Safe protocol. Admirable. Really. But not clinical judgment. That's reserved for physicians." He turned back to the residents and marked her chart with a red pen, actual red ink scratched across the page in front of everyone. It was a gesture calculated to humiliate, to mark her as contaminated in some fundamental way. The pen's click as he uncapped it had been audible. The scratch of ink across paper. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the ventilation system whispering through the ceiling vents. Hannah maintained her position. Jaw tight enough that her teeth could have cut glass. Hand steady. Eyes still on that point past everyone's heads. Her 3 years of invisibility had been engineered carefully, the right clothes, the right deportment, the absolute absence of anything that might draw attention or require explanation. And she'd maintained that invisibility through every shift, every microaggression, every institutional slight. She could maintain it through this. Composure wasn't the absence of feeling. It was the absolute mastery of its expression. Caldwell concluded his remarks and turned his attention to the next chart, the next case study, the next opportunity to cement his position as the final arbiter of clinical truth in this hospital. The residents began scratching notes, the moment of her public dissection already moving into memory. That was the insidious genius of his approach. It was never just one thing. It was the accumulation. The way humiliation lost its power if you repeated it enough times. Eventually, it became the baseline. By 3:33 p.m. that same afternoon, Hannah was on the third floor restocking the medication cabinet in the orthopedic ward when she heard voices approaching from down the corridor. Her hands continued their work, mechanical, practiced, the kind of motion that required no conscious thought. She didn't look up when the two residents rounded the corner, their white coats still crisp, their confidence still flushed from grand rounds where they'd laughed at the right moments and positioned themselves on the winning side. "Hey, nobody!" The taller one, she thought his name was Reeves, or something that sounded like it, had arrived at the vending machine 3 feet to her left. "Dr. Caldwell wants to know if you're planning to do his job for him tomorrow too." His companion snorted, already reaching for the vending machine's coin slot. "Yeah, like maybe you could write him some notes about how to do emergency medicine. Your credentials seem almost as good as his." The sarcasm was so thick you could have cut it with a scalpel. "I'm sure that 3-year degree means something in an alternate universe somewhere." Hannah's hands continued moving. Inventory. Count. Log. The tasks required just enough attention that she could perform them while part of her mind occupied a completely different space. The part that had learned to exist somewhere the words couldn't touch. She'd heard similar observations at FOB Shank, just in different languages. The language didn't matter much when the intent was consistent. "Come on, even acknowledge it," Reeves pressed. "Just one comment. You've got an opinion on everything else." She turned to face them then, and something in her expression must have registered as finality, because the humor drained from both their faces. She wasn't angry. That would have been easier. Anger they could work with, could mock, could escalate. What they saw instead was someone looking at them from across a distance they couldn't measure, calm, present, utterly unreachable. Her voice, when it came, was pitched low enough that they had to lean in to hear it, which made them both feel instinctively uncomfortable. Not interested in this conversation. She turned back to the medication cabinet and continued her work. The residents exchanged a glance, frustration mixed with something that might have been respect, or at least the acknowledgement that this particular target wasn't going to react the way they wanted. They left a moment later, their voices already brightening as they moved toward more receptive audiences. But the damage had already been assessed, categorized, filed away in Hannah's mind with all the other small moments that assembled themselves into a larger pattern. From his office window 1 floor above, where the afternoon light slanted through Venetian blinds, Dr. Caldwell had watched the entire interaction. He'd been in his office when the residents left grand rounds, already reaching for his phone. He had a call to place. The board chairman owed him favors, 3 separate instances of malpractice complaints that Caldwell had helped bury in the right filing cabinets, 2 of them involving improper medication administration that could have ended careers with different handling. 1 phone call to the right person, the kind of person who understood how these things worked, and everything would start moving in the direction Caldwell needed it to move. His voice, when he finally dialed, carried the tone of a concerned colleague sharing observations. "It's me. Listen, I'm seeing some troubling patterns with one of the nursing staff. Hannah Clarke. She's been here 3 years, keeps mostly to herself, but I'm noticing boundary issues. She's been questioning physician orders, in writing, and I think we need to explore whether her credentials are legitimate. Might want credentialing to do a full review. Could be a licensing issue. Better to catch it now before something happens." He paused, listening to the response. I know. These things have to be handled carefully. That's why I'm calling you first. You'll handle it right." By the next morning, Hannah's schedule had changed. Her availability that had been steady for 3 years, for shifts per week, Tuesday through Friday nights, had been reduced to 2 shifts, both pushed to the graveyard shift. The notification arrived as a printed notice in her mailbox, impersonal and final. When she found the scheduling coordinator in her office and asked why, the woman wouldn't meet her eyes. Her fingers fussed with a pen on her desk, finding sudden and urgent interest in its cap. Dr. Caldwell's recommendation came through to administration. He says you need more supervision before you're cleared for a full patient load. Says there are some questions about your clinical judgment that need addressing. Hannah felt the words land, but they didn't land where Caldwell intended. The sting wasn't in the schedule reduction or even in the formal questioning of her competence. The sting was in knowing that it had started. That the machinery was now in motion. That invisibility, once broken, couldn't be reassembled. She signed the acknowledgement form with a steady hand, her signature precise and legible, the way everything she did was precise and legible. That night she sat in her car in the parking garage at St. Michael's, engine off, darkness pressing against the windows like something alive. The parking garage smelled like motor oil and wet concrete, that specific combination of every hospital parking structure ever built. Her hands rested on the steering wheel. Completely still. Completely steady. But her breathing had changed, shallower, faster, the way breathing changed when you recognized the shape of something before it arrived. She didn't cry. She didn't punch the steering wheel or scream into the darkness. Instead, she sat perfectly motionless for 20 minutes while the reality of what Caldwell had initiated assembled itself into clarity. The great fortress she'd built out of invisibility had a seam now. Someone had found it. And now it was opening. At 9:53 p.m. exactly, 31 hours after the schedule reduction was finalized, the ambulance bay doors at St. Michael's would crash open to announce an arrival that would change the entire calculation. The ambulance bay doors crashed open at 9:53 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the night shift snapped into motion like a reflex. The gurney rolled through with a speed that suggested injury beyond the routine, blood-stained sheets, one arm hanging limp, monitors already screaming their preliminary warnings. The paramedics called out vitals as they moved, male, mid-40s, blunt force trauma to the abdomen, approximately 90 minutes since initial injury, BP dropping. Hannah Clarke moved toward the stretcher with the others, her hands already reaching for the intake clipboard, her eyes already cataloging the damage visible even beneath the trauma dressings. This was the work she'd done 1,000 times in this hospital. This was also not the work she'd done 1,000 times. No wallet. No identification card. No phone wedged in a back pocket. The John Doe's personal effects had been bagged and tagged by the paramedics, a watch with a cracked face, a set of keys with a faded carabiner clip, a wedding ring. Nothing that said who he was. And then Hannah noticed it as they transferred him from gurney to trauma bay stretcher, pinned inside his shredded jacket, barely visible beneath the blood-soaked fabric, a Ranger combat badge. Army insignia. The kind that came from Fort Benning, from 75th Regiment training, from deployments to places that didn't officially exist. Her eyes held on it for exactly 1 second before moving to the fore line. The combat medic rotating through from Camp Pendleton was standing across the stretcher, prepping the second foresight, and something in the room's energy shifted when Hannah reached for the patient's arm. She found the antecubital vein with the kind of practiced precision that came from having done this in a field hospital in Tikrit with incoming fire rattling the concrete around her head. The needle went in smooth. The catheter seated without resistance. She was already wrapping the line when the medic froze mid-handoff, his hands suspended above the fore pump, his eyes locked on her suture technique. She was finishing the line securing, not the standard hospital knot, but something else. Something older. Something that would hold through movement and jarring, that would stay secure when a patient was being loaded onto a Black Hawk under fire. That's a Tikrit stitch pattern, the medic said, his voice low, almost questioning. Just barely loud enough for Hannah to hear it over the monitors and the paramedics calling out final vitals. His name was Mitchell. His eyes had seen things. His hands knew what he was looking at. Hannah didn't answer. She turned away, reaching for the next foresight with the same methodical focus, her hands moving through the steps she'd learned in a place where mistakes meant body bags and helicopter transport could take 40 minutes or could take forever. The tremor that ran through her fingers wasn't from fear. It was from recognition. It was from the knowledge that she was being seen, truly seen, for the first time in 3 years at St. Michael's. Her hands remembered Tikrit. Her hands remembered the screaming. Her hands remembered the 13-year-old whose arm had been nearly severed and who she'd sutured back together in 19 minutes because there was no one else to do it and he was going to lose that arm if she didn't. The medic said nothing else. He went back to his work. But his eyes kept finding hers when he thought she wasn't looking. The patient stabilized enough for the initial assessment. Blood type O negative. Cross-match running. Imaging ordered. The trauma bay settled into that specific rhythm of controlled urgency, fast but not panic, practiced but not casual. Hannah moved between monitoring stations, calling out vitals, recording times, her voice measured and professional and completely divorced from the name badge that said Clarke, RN. Dr. Caldwell stood in the observation area, his arms crossed, his expression carrying that particular satisfaction of a man watching someone else handle a crisis. He'd learned long ago that watching was easier than doing. That commanding from a distance meant never having to be the person with their hands in blood. At 11:23 p.m., the monitors screamed. Not the urgent beeping of standard tachycardia. The full alarm cascade of a patient whose vital signs were collapsing in real time. The patient's systolic pressure dropped from 102 to 87 to 74 in the span of 10 seconds. The oxygen saturation began its downward crawl. The heart rate climbed past 140 and kept climbing, the body's desperate attempt to compensate for blood loss that was happening internally, faster than the imaging had suggested, worse than anyone had accounted for. The trauma surgeon looked up from the chart. Caldwell finally stepped forward from the observation window. "Start massive transfusion protocol," the surgeon called out. "Get for more units of ONEG up here now." But the numbers weren't improving. They were free-falling. The patient's systolic dropped to 68. Hannah watched the monitor and understood what was happening with the same clarity she'd understood it 743 times before. The initial trauma had torn something internally that imaging couldn't quite see until gravity and time and the stress of transport had made it catastrophic. The bleeding wasn't stopping. The patient was running out of blood to bleed, and every second of delay was a second closer to cardiac arrest. "He needs a thoracotomy," Hannah said. Her voice came out level, which was the voice of someone who'd learned to deliver impossibly bad information without letting the impossibility show. "Immediate surgical intervention. The bleeding is from the chest cavity." Dr. Caldwell's head snapped toward her. "You don't make that call, Nurse Clarke. Step back." The patient's pressure dropped to 54. The heart monitor showed the rhythm beginning to destabilize, the electricity of the heart itself starting to fail under the stress of trying to pump blood that wasn't there anymore. Hannah was already moving. She'd already reached for the sterile glove box. She'd already pulled the kit toward her because she'd learned in Tikrit that waiting for someone else to make the right decision sometimes meant watching someone die. "You are not authorized for surgical procedures," Caldwell said, his voice sharp now, edged with something that looked like panic. "That is a direct order." "Security." The patient coded. The heart monitor went from dysrhythmia to flatline in the span of a breath. The sound it made was the sound Hannah had heard before, in a forward operating base outside Fallujah, in the aftermath of an IED detonation that had killed 2 soldiers and nearly killed a third. It was the sound of running out of time. Caldwell's hands fumbled with the equipment. He'd learned to manage chest compressions in medical school. He'd taken the recertification class every 2 years. He'd never actually performed them on a patient who mattered. The room held its breath. The medic from Camp Pendleton had stopped moving. The resident stared. The monitors continued their flatline screaming. Hannah stepped forward. Past Caldwell. Around him like he was furniture. She positioned herself at the patient's left side and made the decision that would destroy her career in exactly 6 hours, a decision made not with doubt but with the absolute certainty that comes from having already survived the worst. Her hands moved. The blade made the first incision. The rib spreader went in and opened the chest cavity wide enough to work. She could see the damage now. A tear in the internal mammary artery, blood pooling in the thoracic cavity, the patient's heart surrounded by fluid that should never have been there. Direct cardiac massage. Her hands found the heart. Her fingers wrapped around it. The muscle was already beginning to fail, losing its will to contract. She began the massage, not the standard compressions taught in textbooks, but the technique that came from 3 tours and from knowing that sometimes the only thing standing between someone and death was your own willingness to reach into their chest and do what their body couldn't do anymore. Pressure. Release. Pressure. Release. The rhythm of it was like breathing. Like muscle memory. Like hands that had done this before and would do it again. The medic stared. Caldwell stood frozen, useless, his own hands falling to his sides. The monitors held their flat line for 4 more seconds. 5. 6. And then, beneath Hannah's hands, the heart shuddered. Contracted. Found its rhythm again. The flat line on the monitor turned into the blessed electrical storm of sinus rhythm re-establishing itself. The pressure began to climb. 42, 58. 71, the oxygen saturation found itself again. The patient's heart was beating because Hannah Clarke's hands had taught it to. She finished the manual massage. Checked the cardiac monitor 1 more time to confirm stability. Stripped off her gloves. And walked to the sink without looking at anyone, without acknowledging the silence that had turned the trauma bay into a place where nobody was breathing. She washed her hands. The blood swirled down the drain in pink spirals that looked almost gentle under the fluorescent light. Behind her, the residents were already moving again, already calling for additional surgical support, already doing the work that came next. The John Doe was alive. The monitors showed steady rhythm. The patient would survive the night because Hannah Clarke had refused to wait for permission. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Caldwell had already pulled his phone from his pocket, and his fingers were already dialing numbers he'd memorized years ago, the board chairman, the credentialing committee, the private investigator who'd worked for him before. His face had gone pale. His certainty had evaporated like water on hot asphalt. And he understood, in that moment, that he'd just watched a nurse do something he would never be capable of doing, and that understanding was going to cost him everything. By 6 in the morning, Hannah knew what was coming. She could read it in the way Dr. Caldwell moved through the hospital corridors, fast, deliberate, avoiding the trauma bay entirely. He was a man constructing a narrative, and she'd learned long ago that silence was the only composure that mattered when the machinery started turning against you. The fluorescent lights cast everything in that sickly institutional glow that made skin look like raw meat and secrets look inevitable. She'd saved a life last night. She'd also signed her own termination papers the moment her hands moved beyond the scope of what a nurse was permitted to do. Caldwell's office phone call started at 6:36 a.m. Hannah heard about them within an hour. Hospital networks moved faster than official channels, and one of the older RNs mentioned that Caldwell had locked himself in with his door closed, voice tight and urgent. She was changing a patient's for line when the resident passed along the gossip. Caldwell had called the board chairman directly. Then the credentialing committee members. The ones he'd cultivated over years of covering mistakes and returning favors. The architecture of his power was predictable in its precision. One call to leverage a past favor, another to remind someone what he knew about their billing practices, a third to activate alliances forged in the small compromises that held most institutions together. By 7:15 a.m., Hannah was summoned to the administrative conference room on the 3rd floor. The moment she walked in, she understood the geometry of the ambush. Caldwell sat at the head of a polished conference table with 3 physicians flanking him, the credentialing committee, all of them looking uncomfortable in the way people look when they know they're about to help dismantle someone. The hospital administrator, a woman named Patricia whose job was entirely dependent on Caldwell's favor, sat to his right. Caldwell's smile was the smile of a man who'd already won. "Nurse Clarke, you are hereby placed on immediate suspension for practicing beyond scope of practice," the administrator said, still not meeting Hannah's eyes. "Your actions last night constituted an authorized surgery." The words came out like they'd been rehearsed, which they had. "You performed a procedure that is exclusively within the physician's domain." That makes you a liability. Hannah stood motionless. Her hands were steady. Her face was blank, the same composure she'd maintained when rounds of 7.62mm rounds came through a clinic wall in Tikrit, the same stillness she'd held when pulling a dying man from burning wreckage. Caldwell watched for a flinch. For tears. For the trembling collapse he was counting on. She gave him nothing. She saved his life, came a voice from the doorway. The combat medic from Camp Pendleton, the one who'd recognized her suture pattern, stood in the frame, still in his army combat uniform. That ranger would be dead if she hadn't moved. Caldwell cut him off without looking. She violated every protocol we have. She's a danger to patients and staff. The decision is final. The medic's jaw tightened, but he was outnumbered and he knew it. The machinery of institution always moved faster than the voice of truth. By 8:19 a.m., security was walking her out. 2 officers in polo shirts with radios on their belts, professional and impersonal, the way institutions keep their cruelty clean. Hannah carried one small box, a coffee mug from a deployment, a sweater her daughter had given her, a photograph of her child at age 6. Her badge had already been deactivated. Her access codes were dead. She was a ghost in a building where she'd spent 3 years quietly saving lives. As they passed the nurse's station, her colleagues looked away. Not glancing down at their screens. Looking deliberately away, the way people do when they're afraid that witnessing your humiliation makes them complicit. Which it does. The combat medic watched from the corridor. Before security could escort him out too, he pulled out his phone and stepped into a supply closet. His fingers moved fast across the screen, typing out a message to a sergeant at Camp Pendleton, typing "You need to call up. Valkyrie just got terminated. I know the name from the Tikrit extraction briefings. It's her." 3 years of classified operation protocols and 12 hours of exposure had been enough to trigger a chain of calls that would eventually reach people who had authorization to know what the Pentagon had ordered erased. By noon, Caldwell had hired a private investigator. A man named Harrison with a file full of background check credentials and a reputation for finding what hospitals needed to find when they wanted to destroy someone quietly. Caldwell sat across from him in a coffee shop 3 blocks from St. Michael's, voice low. "I want everything. Previous employment. References. Credentials. Something about her doesn't add up. No one moves like that unless they have training." The investigator wrote it all down. Caldwell was offering $30,000 for a fast turnaround. What Caldwell didn't understand, what no one in the hospital understood, was that some training leaves trails that reach back to people who still had very active reasons to know where those trails led. At 3 in the afternoon, Hannah sat at her kitchen table in a small house in Miramar with morning light coming through the windows at that angle that made everything look like it was dissolving. The pair of worn combat boots sat in front of her, the one she'd retrieved from the garage, the one she hadn't looked at in 3 years. The leather was cracked. The laces were frayed. The sole on the right boot was coming loose from the heel where she'd landed wrong during a fast rope insertion. Every scar on those boots was a memory she'd been ordered to forget. Every scuff mark was a moment the Pentagon had officially erased. She'd agreed to die on paper. She'd agreed to become a ghost. She'd agreed to let the 12 men she'd pulled out of burning hellfire live as if she'd never existed. The grief broke through her like a dam collapsing. She was sobbing with the kind of intensity that comes from 3 years of holding it back, 3 years of compartmentalizing trauma, 3 years of being ordered to silence by people who had the authority to make silence absolute. Her hands shook as they gripped the edge of the table. The sound she made was the sound of someone who'd learned to survive by not being seen, by not being heard, by being a ghost so completely that even her own humanity had become a security risk. Tears streamed down her face and she didn't wipe them away because the gesture felt pointless. She stared at those boots and thought about the faces of 12 men, their names classified, their identities protected, their survival dependent on her permanent erasure, and she understood that losing her career was the price she'd already agreed to pay. She didn't hear the front door open. Didn't hear her daughter's feet on the tile floor. Didn't hear anything until a small voice broke through her grief like a weapon. "Mommy, Why are you crying?" Hannah's daughter stood in the doorway of the kitchen, home from school early, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her eyes wide with the terror that children have when they see their protector fall. Hannah looked up and found she couldn't speak. Couldn't explain. Couldn't tell this child the truth, that her mother had been ordered by the Pentagon to disappear, that she'd agreed to die in every way except the biological one, that she'd held the secret of 12 men's survival in her chest for 3 years, that the price of their lives was her own erasure. "Mommy's just having a hard day, sweetheart," Hannah whispered, her voice breaking on every word. She pulled her daughter into her arms and held her, this child who deserved a mother who wasn't broken, who wasn't haunted, who wasn't being systematically destroyed by an institution that had already destroyed everything else she was. Sometimes grown-ups just have really hard days. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that in 48 hours, the entire world would begin to understand exactly what she'd been forced to hide. 3 days later, the hospital lobby erupted into controlled chaos, staff on lunch break, visitors streaming through automatic doors, the vending machine humming its monotonous rhythm near the west entrance. The fluorescent lights cast everything in that particular shade of institutional white, the kind of white that made time feel suspended, untethered. CNN played on the mounted television above the reception desk. Nobody was watching. Then the broadcast cut to breaking news and the entire room went dead silent. A photograph filled the screen. Female. Military uniform. Navy Cross citation scrolling beneath her name. The Chiron read, Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke, presumed dead after black OPS extraction in Tikrit, spotted in San Diego. The broadcaster's voice carried the stunned tone of someone reading something they didn't quite believe. The decorated Navy SEAL Team 3 operative, missing since 2015, appeared in San Diego 3 days ago. She's been located at St. Michael's Hospital, where sources indicate she's been employed for 36 months under an assumed identity. The photograph changed. The John Doe patient, now identified as an Army Ranger, now conscious, now very much alive, filled the screen next to Hannah's official military portrait. His words came through the speakers, recorded from his hospital bed. Chief Clarke pulled me out of a burning building in Tikrit. She pulled me out again this week. Same woman. Same hands. Same everything. The room erupted. Staff members froze mid-conversation. A doctor dropped his sandwich on the tile floor. The volunteers at the information desk stared upward at the television as if it might suddenly announce they'd all been dreaming. A nurse whispered to her colleague, "Nurse, nobody was Navy SEAL Team 3. The other nurse shook her head slowly. "Master Chief. That's E9. That's the highest enlisted rank in the entire Navy." In the distance, an elevator chimed. Dr. Caldwell stepped into the lobby in his custom Italian loafers, his white coat pristine, his posture the careful architecture of a man who had built empires on the backs of people nobody was watching. He glanced up at the television screen. He saw the photograph. He saw Hannah's name. The blood drained from his face in stages, first his cheeks, then his lips, then the space around his eyes until his entire head resembled something excavated from marble. The Ranger patient stood near the West Wing entrance in his hospital gown, and 4 lines still taped to his inner elbow, his chest wrapped in surgical tape that barely contained the trauma beneath. Beside him stood a veteran security guard, someone who'd spent 22 years in the Army before 3 tours in Afghanistan had convinced him that civilian life required a different kind of watching over people. When the guard saw Dr. Caldwell, he snapped to attention with the kind of reflex that lives in muscle memory forever. The Ranger patient smiled, the smile of a man who'd been rescued twice by the same person and was about to watch the world understand what that meant. "She pulled me out once before," the Ranger said to Caldwell, his voice carrying across the lobby like a radio transmission cutting through static. "Codename Valkyrie. Pulled me and 11 others out of a burning compound in Tikrit when the extraction team couldn't reach us." His eyes locked on Caldwell's. "She had nothing to lose. That's when people become most dangerous, sir. That's when they become heroes." The veteran security guard moved slightly, angling his body toward Caldwell with the fluid precision of someone trained to control space. His voice was quiet, but it reached every corner of the lobby, past the coffee stations and past the gift shop, straight into the collective understanding of everyone listening, Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke. Navy Cross recipient. 3 classified operations. 12 combat saves, all documented. All verified. The hospital doors burst open like someone had kicked them from the outside. A 2-star general entered first, marine dress blue so sharp they could cut glass, followed by a Navy legal officer carrying a file folder that was visibly thick, visibly heavy, the kind of folder that ends careers. The general moved with a kind of authority that didn't need volume. His presence alone shifted the air pressure in the room, made the temperature feel different. His eyes found Caldwell immediately. "Dr. Caldwell," the general said. It wasn't a greeting. It was a command. "We need to discuss the credentialing investigation you initiated. The one targeting Master Chief Clarke. The one that triggered a federal audit of St. Michael's billing records for the past 24 months. Caldwell's mouth opened. Nothing came out. His phone buzzed. He reached for it automatically. The message from the board chairman read, "Investigation expanded. Medicare fraud suspected. Your files are under seal. Don't speak to anyone. We're retaining outside counsel." The general opened the folder. His voice was steady, each word a nail in a coffin. Phantom surgeries. 23 of them. Billed to Medicare. Equipment purchases that never arrived. Pharmaceutical orders diverted to private resale. All authorizations traceable to you. All documented. All criminal. He paused. His eyes were the color of a cold Atlantic. Master Chief Clarke's credibility triggered the audit. The credibility you tried to destroy. The second buzz came from Caldwell's administrative assistant, board chair and surgical chief both refuse your calls. Emergency meeting called. You're not invited. The Ranger patient watched Caldwell's face as it cycled through understanding, denial, and finally the peculiar kind of stillness that comes when someone realizes their entire world has rotated 90 degrees and they're falling. "Sir," the Ranger said quietly, "she saved my life. Twice. How many of your patients did you save? Or just Bill?" The general handed the folder to a hospital administrator who'd appeared from somewhere in the building, moving with the speed of someone who'd just been told to cooperate with federal investigators or face institutional charges. The administrator's face was gray. He'd signed off on Caldwell's hiring. He'd ignored the billing irregularities. He'd approved the credentialing investigation. Now he looked at the Ranger, at the general, at the television screen still showing Hannah's photograph, and something in his expression shifted toward genuine horror at what he'd enabled. By 2:08 p.m. that same afternoon, the hospital board convened without Caldwell present. By 4:15 p.m., his medical license was suspended pending criminal investigation. By 6:44 p.m., the evening news carried photographs of the audit findings. By midnight, the first charges, wire fraud, conspiracy, healthcare billing fraud involving amounts exceeding $2.1 million, were filed with the U.S. Attorney's Office. 30 days later, the credentialing committee met in an emergency session and unanimously voted to revoke Caldwell's hospital privileges. The residents who'd mocked Hannah at the vending machine suddenly found themselves reassigned, their evaluations noting behavior inconsistent with institutional values. The scheduling coordinator who'd reduced Hannah's shifts requested a transfer. The attending physicians who'd remained silent during grand rounds began writing detailed statements about Caldwell's history of erratic behavior and intimidation tactics. 6 months later, Hannah clipped her Master Chief insignia onto her new administrator's jacket, the insignia she'd been forbidden to wear, the insignia she'd been ordered to bury, as St. Michael's announced her appointment as Director of Emergency Medicine. She was 41 years old. She was the youngest director the hospital had ever hired. She was the first former enlisted service member to hold the position. And her photograph appeared in the San Diego Union Tribune next to an article about her decorated military career, her forced retirement, and her 3 years of silence. That same week, through the hospital's front windows on the 4th floor, Hannah watched Dr. Caldwell sitting at a folding table between a tax preparation service and a nail salon in a strip mall parking lot 32 miles from St. Michael's. He wore a cheap polo shirt with an insurance company logo. He was handing out brochures to people who wouldn't meet his eyes. His hands trembled as he reached for another stack of pamphlets. His medical license hung in the balance. His criminal trial was scheduled for September. His reputation had been incinerated in the process of revealing Hannah's. She didn't smile. She didn't feel satisfaction. She simply noted the fact of his diminishment the way she noted anything else, as data, as information, as something that had been necessary. The trembling in his hands didn't mirror the restraint in hers. One was fear. The other was the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst the world could offer. In her new office on the 4th floor, Hannah placed the pair of worn combat boots on the shelf where they belonged. The leather was creased from 3 years of hiding them. The laces were tied the way she'd learned in basic training, 2 loops, pulled tight, ready to run at any moment. She ran her fingers across the worn heel, the place where she'd walked through fire, the place where she'd carried people to safety when nobody else would. The boots sat in afternoon light that filtered through her window, and for the first time in 36 months, they didn't have to hide. The Ranger patient stopped by her office that evening. He was recovering faster than anyone expected. He said, "I wanted to say thank you. Not for saving me. For saving all of us. And for not letting Caldwell win." Hannah looked at him, really looked at him, and something in her expression softened. "You're going back to active duty. 30 days. Why? Because soldiers like you deserve to serve without wondering if the system's broken. We're going to fix the system. Starting here." What she didn't tell him was that the general had called 3 days after the audit wrapped. He'd offered her a position on a Navy command investigating other cases like hers, military personnel forced into civilian erasure, ordered to hide their service, silenced by classification protocols. She'd thought about it for 23 hours. Then she'd declined. She had a daughter who needed to know her mother wasn't vanishing again. She had a hospital that needed leadership grounded in the reality of how power gets abused. She had boots that finally didn't have to hide. The Pendleton medic, the one who'd recognized her Tikrit stitch pattern, requested a permanent transfer to St. Michael's to work under her direction. She approved it within 4 hours. By month 3 of her tenure, she'd implemented whistleblower protections that would have saved her 3 years of silence. By month 6, she'd fired 2 more administrators who'd participated in fraudulent billing schemes and promoted 3 nurses who'd been systematically silenced by the old regime. And every evening before she left her office, Hannah stood in front of the window overlooking San Diego, looked at her reflection in the glass, and said the words she'd been forced to hide: "I am a Master Chief Petty Officer in the United States Navy. I served. I was counted. I mattered. And I still do." Subscribe for more stories about the warriors walking among us, the ones who've seen the worst and still choose to give the most. These aren't just stories about survival. They're stories about what happens when hidden strength finally gets seen.